This is the story behind some of my favorite photos from this past year. When we went down to Patagonia at the end of 2009, I certainly had no intention of taking a photo like this. As with most of my trips, it was all about the wildlife. We started out on Peninsula Valdez and then headed south to Tierra del Fuego. And while we saw plenty of animals, it was a little bit disappointing. Probably the main highlight was our encounter with this austral pygmy owl in the La Pitaya forest. I always knew that if the wildlife didn't come through, we might have some nice landscape opportunities. And the best bet seemed to be in the town of Chaltén, which sits in the shadow of Mount Fitzroy in Serra Torre. We planned an early morning hike in hopes of getting some sunrise photo opportunities on the face of Fitzroy. We made it plenty early, so I took some time to take some long exposures, try some star trails, none of which really worked out. And we never got our sunrise shots either, thanks to the cloud cover. This shot was a pleasant surprise, though, with the constellation of Orion hovering above Fitzroy and the hills aglow thanks to the lights from Chaltén. In March, I had my first opportunity to cover Husky Crew, a sport with a long and proud tradition at the University of Washington. This particular event was Class Day, which pits various graduating classes against each other within the crew program. I was able to hop on a boat with one of the assistant coaches and follow along throughout the day. Despite the attire, this is a serious event. With the caliber of athletes in the crew program, there's a lot of pride on the line and the competition is fierce. That was especially the case in the final men's race. The freshman and sophomore boats were particularly powerful, so it was a bit of an upset when the juniors actually won the tightly contested race. At the end of the day, trophies are awarded and coxswains get thrown into the drink. In this case, Michelle Darby was the coxswain for the winning junior boat, so she took a ride into Lake Washington. A fun moment on a fun day. May traditionally means Yellowstone for me, in large part because it's the best time of the year to see wildlife in the park, and especially baby animals. What ended up being a relatively slow week compared to past May trips ended on a high note when I came across a large bear jam near Grizzly Lake. The crowd was watching this sow and two cubs high up on the hillside, and though they were bedded down when I arrived, the bears roused themselves and soon headed downhill toward us. We got to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour watching them play on the hillside as Mom foraged around. It was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, after the show was over, one of my memory cards was irreparably damaged, so I lost most of my footage from the afternoon. This shot is probably my favorite from the encounter, so at least I came away with a nice souvenir. These next three photos represent the highlight of the year for me, and one of the top wildlife encounters of my life. This was from our great trip to South Africa in August. We got to spend 3 mornings with a female leopard and her 5-week-old cub. When we first arrived at Mala Mala Game Reserve, we told our guide that we were interested in seeing leopards, and he had some good news for us. He said this cub had just been discovered the week prior to our arrival. If we were lucky, we would get to see it. So we headed out early, the first morning, before dawn, and we arrived at the den site, and were fortunate to have both mother and cub waiting for us. There was great light, the cub was very active and playful, and finally came out into the open. There was a lot of grass around in the way, but it crept into the open at this point, and probably made for my favorite photo of the year, both thanks to the behavior and just the fact that it's gosh darn cute. Things got really interesting on the third morning. We were watching the mother groom the cub, and then she suddenly grabbed it in her jaws and moved down off the rocks. We figured she was just going down to the grass, but it turned out she was actually moving the cub to a new den site, and there was barely time to get a picture of this rare behavior as she brought the cub right at us and then moved on behind us across the road. She took the cub to a new set of boulders, and they eventually settled in. It was much tougher to find an angle here, but eventually we were able to see the cub as it started to get around and explore its new surroundings. Photography was certainly more difficult from this angle, but it did provide a nice family portrait with the mother protectively looking over the shoulder of the cub. One of my favorite encounters of the year actually came on New Year's Eve during our winter trip to Yellowstone. I've been told about some otters out in the Lamar Valley, and since it had been a couple of years since I photographed otters, this was an opportunity that was too good to pass up. Sure enough, when we pulled up, we could see the otters in the distance out by the river, so we put on our snowshoes and tromped out there. Otters are such a fun subject to watch and photograph, and these were no exception. They were scratching themselves, they were swimming, one had actually caught a fish and was eating it out by the riverbank, and we just missed as an eagle flew down to try and steal the fish away. But the eagle was unsuccessful. Immediately afterwards, 2 coyotes showed up and started roaming the area. One coyote decided to approach where one of the otters was swimming, and normally you would expect the otter to run away, but in this case the otter jumped out and chased after the coyote. The coyote was probably as surprised as we were, and it turned tail and ran, and the otter just kept on moving along, jumped back in the river, and swam off like nothing had happened. This ended up being my favorite shot from the encounter, with the otter looking surprisingly tough and aggressive as it chases the coyote away.